The blade was already at Marius Dragomir's throat when Amara Sinclair stepped in front of him, not behind him, not beside him, in front of him, with her chin raised and her dark eyes fixed on the vampire holding the obsidian-edged dagger, her classroom steady voice cutting through the cold underground air of the Dracovian court like she was quieting a room full of unruly 16-year-olds. "Put it down," she said. The court gasped. 200 vampires, each older than most nations, draped in silk and old blood and centuries of cruelty, and not one of them had ever seen a human step in front of the great Marius Dragomir, the head guard, the Iron Sentinel of House Dracovian, the vampire who had, in 400 years of service, never once allowed a blade to reach anyone he had sworn to protect. And here was a human woman standing between him and death. The vampire with a dagger was named Seraphine Voss, and he was smiling with the particular satisfaction of a man who had planned this moment for a long time. He had white hair, like all of them, pale as winter frost, and swept back from a sharp face that had once been called handsome before cruelty finished carving it. His eyes were the color of old amber, and they moved from Amara to Marius with the slow, deliberate pleasure of someone who had just proved a point. "Step aside, little teacher," Seraphine said softly. "This does not concern you. You tried to poison him," Amara said, and her voice did not shake. "You laced the offering cup he was meant to drink at the ceremony. I watched you do it, so it absolutely concerns me." Marius stood behind her, and the feeling in his chest was something so foreign to him that for a single suspended heartbeat he could not name it. In 4 centuries, he had shielded princes and elder lords, blood-sworn children of ancient houses, queens who commanded armies and chancellors who rewrote law with a signature. He had stood between all of them and every conceivable form of darkness. No one had ever stood between Marius Dragomir and anything. He could have moved her aside. He was a vampire of considerable age and power, and the strength required to step around one determined human woman was essentially nothing. But his feet were rooted to the black marble floor, because in his 400 years of living, no one had ever looked at him the way Amara Sinclair was looking at Seraphine Voss right now, like Marius was worth protecting. Like the thought of something happening to him was simply unacceptable, and she had decided, with the same quiet certainty she brought to every decision, to do something about it. He felt something crack open in him that had been sealed so long he had forgotten it was there. "Move," Seraphine said, and the warmth left his voice entirely. "I have already sent word to the High Council," Amara said. "The message went out 12 minutes ago. I documented everything I witnessed, including the specific compound you used, which I identified from the court records I was given access to for my research. You have perhaps another 15 minutes before this room fills with High Council enforcers who will have questions that are very difficult to answer." The silence that followed was extraordinary. Seraphine stared at her, the court stared at her, and Marius Dragomir, 400 years old, veteran of blood wars and court betrayals and ancient vows written in languages that no longer existed, stared at the back of the head of a 32-year-old high school history teacher from Portland, Oregon, and felt something in him fall completely and irrevocably apart. It had started 3 months ago, and not at all the way he would have expected anything important to begin. The Dracovian court operated in the modern world with a kind of elegant secrecy that centuries of practice produced. Beneath the city of Vienna, behind a door that appeared on no map and opened only with specific blood-keyed credentials, lay a network of halls and chambers that rivaled any palace above ground. The court maintained a careful relationship with select human institutions, scholars, and archivists primarily, individuals who were granted controlled access to certain historical documents in exchange for the vampire's ability to monitor what human academia was publishing about ancient history. It was a system of mutual benefit that the court had refined over 2 centuries. Amara Sinclair had come to them through this system, recommended by the Historical Research Department at the University of Vienna for her work on pre-medieval Eastern European social structures. She was thorough, methodical, and possessed an unusual gift for reading between the lines of documents that other scholars dismissed as mythology. She had also, within her first week of supervised archive access, politely but very clearly told the junior court official assigned to monitor her that his organization system was inefficient and offered 3 specific improvements. The court official had been 260 years old. He had been deeply offended and deeply impressed in equal measure. Marius had not been assigned to oversee her. His responsibilities lay with the inner court, the security of the ruling elder Vladek Dracovian, and the chain of command beneath him. He had encountered Amara Sinclair by accident, stepping into the archive corridor at an odd hour to retrieve a document Vladek had requested, and finding her there at a reading table, surrounded by carefully organized stacks of parchment, her dark hair twisted up with a pencil holding it in place. Reading by the warm amber light of the court's interior lamps, with the focused intensity of someone who had forgotten there was a world outside of what she was studying. He had stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to. She had looked up without startling, which surprised him. Most humans startled when they suddenly registered a vampire nearby. Something in the animal brain recognized the proximity of a predator. Amara had simply looked up, assessed him with calm dark eyes, and said, "You are not Administrator Gregor." "No," he had agreed. "Are you here for a document?" "Yes, which one?" he had told her, and she had turned back to her stacks and located it with efficient precision, and handed it across the table to him without ceremony. Then she had returned to her own reading as though he were a perfectly ordinary librarian, and the exchange had been perfectly ordinary, and Marius had found himself standing with the document in his hands, not leaving. "You are comfortable here," he had said finally. She had looked up again, this time with a slight furrow between her brows that he would come to recognize as her thinking expression. "I am comfortable in archives. Yes, I have been coming to this one for 2 weeks. It would be strange if I were not comfortable by now. You are not uncomfortable with the nature of the court. I teach history," she said. "I find it remarkable that there are beings in this room who remember the things I teach as current events. That is not uncomfortable. That is extraordinary." Why would I be uncomfortable with something extraordinary? Marius had left with the document and returned to the inner court and stood for several minutes afterward, thinking about that answer, turning it over in his mind the way he turned over intelligence reports, looking for weaknesses in the logic. He had not found any. He had gone back to the archive the following evening under no particular pretense, and she had been there again, and this time she had asked him a question about a military campaign in 1347 that she had found referenced obliquely in 3 separate documents ends, and he had sat down across from her and answered it, because he had been there and he remembered it clearly. And watching her face as he spoke, the hunger for information that she could not fully contain despite her composure, had been one of the most purely interesting experiences he could remember having in decades. They had talked for 2 hours. He had told her more than he intended, not because she was clever about extracting information, though she was very clever, but because speaking to someone who received what he said with genuine intellectual engagement rather than performance or fear was something he had forgotten could exist. She never performed anything. That was what set her apart from every court inhabitant he had ever known. 200 years of court life trained everyone to perform, to present, to manage how they were perceived. Amara Sinclair said what she meant and meant what she said, and if she did not know something, she said so, and if she disagreed, she said that too, in that quiet, even voice that did not rise to make her point, but simply placed it directly in front of you and waited for you to engage with it. By the 3rd week, he was returning to the archive every evening. By the 5th week, he had arranged for her to have expanded access to sections of the archive that were not typically available to outside researchers. He told himself this was because her research was genuinely contributing to the court's understanding of its own documented history, which was true. He did not examine the rest of his reasons very carefully. She had noticed his shift in behavior before he fully acknowledged it himself. They had been in the corridor together one evening, walking back from a deeper section of the archive, and she had stopped and looked at him with that particular direct quality she had, and said, "Marius, you understand that you do not need to escort me back and forth through these corridors, do you not? I have full clearance. I know the routes. I am aware," he said. "And yet you have walked me back from the Eastern Archive every evening for the past 3 weeks. It is on my route. It is categorically not on your route," she said. And there was something in her eyes, not mockery, but something warm and precise, like she was offering him room to be honest without any pressure attached. "I am not complaining. I am simply noting that a vampire of your position does not reroute himself for no reason." He had looked at her for a long moment. The corridor was one of the older ones, carved stone, lined with bronze fixtures that held soft lights. And in that light she was very clear and very real in a way that made something in him ache, with a feeling he had filed under the general category of things to not examine. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "I find the route preferable when it has better company." She had smiled at that, not coyly, just warmly, openly, like a person who was pleased and saw no reason to hide it. "I find it preferable too," she had said simply. They had not been able to avoid the complication much longer after that. The problem was Seraphine Voss, though Marius had not yet understood the full shape of what Seraphine was building. Seraphine was the 3rd elder of House Dracovian, a position of significant power, and he had spent several decades quietly and very patiently constructing a network of alliances within the court that were aimed at one specific outcome: the removal of Elder Vladek and the installation of Seraphine in his place. The plan was layered and careful, and predicated on eliminating every obstacle in sequence. Marius was the largest obstacle, as Head Guard Marius's loyalty to Vladek was the primary security architecture of the inner court. Any move against Vladek had to go through or around Marius first. Seraphine had decided, after considerable analysis, that a direct confrontation with Marius was too risky. But Marius, for all his 4 centuries of vigilance, had one untested vulnerability. He had never, in all that time, cared about anyone for whom he was not professionally responsible. Seraphine had noticed the archive visits. He had noticed everything, what Marius had not known, in those evenings of conversation and escort routes and the slow, serious building of something real between himself and Amara was that Seraphine had begun watching her. That Seraphine had assessed her and identified her as a potential lever, a way to distract or compromise the Iron Sentinel, and had begun laying groundwork to either use her or eliminate her, depending on how circumstances developed. What Seraphine had not accounted for was that Amara Sinclair was not a passive element in anyone else's plan. She had noticed things as she always noticed things. She had been in the archive one evening, going through secondary court records that a junior official had left unsecured by mistake when she had found the documentation trail. It was not labeled anything so obvious as conspiracy, but she was a historian and she read primary sources for a living. And what she found was a series of transfer records and correspondence that, assembled in sequence, drew a very clear picture. Someone had been funneling resources toward a specific ceremony preparation. The offering ceremony for the new moon convocation, which was a court tradition she had read about but never witnessed, during which the head guard was required to drink from a ritual cup to formally renew his sworn bond. She had cross-referenced the compounds, listed in the court's historical records, of what she privately thought of as bad things people had put in drinks. Because court history was extensive on this subject, and she had identified what she believed was a specific blood-suppressant compound, one that would not kill a vampire, but would strip them of their abilities for a period of 48 hours, long enough for someone to eliminate them without the usual complications. She had sat with that information for exactly 1 hour, which was how long she needed to think through her options, verify her conclusions, and decide what to do. Then she had done 2 things. First, she had quietly sent word to the High Council through the contact information she had been given at the start of her archive clearance, the emergency notification channel that she had been told was only for genuine crises involving human safety, but which she was currently reinterpreting as applicable to the situation at hand. Second, she had gone to the offering ceremony because she had calculated that her message would not arrive in time, and she was not willing to let Marius drink from that cup. She had no weapon. She had no supernatural ability. She had her voice, her documented evidence, her knowledge of the compound, and the absolute certainty, clear and clean inside her, that it felt like something she had always known, that she was not going to let this happen to him. This was the moment the story arrived at, when Seraphine stood with his blade raised, and Amara stood in front of Marius, and the court held its collective breath. Seraphine looked at her for a long moment, and then at Marius, and then back at her, and something shifted in his expression that was less like rage, and more like the specific frustration of a plan encountering a variable it had not modeled. Then his gaze sharpened with something dangerous, the calculation of someone who was deciding that the situation had changed and the variables needed to change with it. "You think you have protected him," Seraphine said softly. "You have simply changed the nature of what I need to do." He moved. He did not move toward Marius. He moved toward Amara, faster than a human eye could track, and Marius moved, faster than Seraphine had anticipated possibles, even knowing exactly what Marius was capable of, because Marius had 4 centuries of protective instinct, and none of it, not 1 year of it, had ever been directed at anyone with this particular fierce urgency. He was in front of Amara before Seraphine crossed half the distance, and the confrontation that followed was not elegant. It was not the formal, structured combat of court duels with their ancient protocols and ceremonial parameters. Marius put himself between Seraphine's blade and Amara Sinclair with the blunt, total commitment of a man who had reached the absolute end of what he was willing to permit, and he was not thinking about court protocol. Seraphine was old and skilled, but he was not Marius, and the difference became apparent very quickly. Marius disarmed him in 3 movements, brought him to the floor, and held him there with the hand at his throat and the specific quality of expression that had made lesser vampires faint in Marius's presence, a cold, absolute focus that left no question about consequences. "Do not move," Marius said, and his voice was very quiet, which was much more frightening than loudness would have been. Seraphine did not move. The doors at the far end of the great hall opened 11 minutes after that, which meant Amara's message had arrived in 13 minutes rather than 15, and the High Council enforcers who entered were 12 in number and wore the silver insignia of the oldest governing body in vampire society, the council that predated most of the houses that had written the original blood laws, and before which no elder, however ancient, was exempt. Elder Vladek, who had been standing at the side of the room, appeared at Marius's side with a speed that betrayed his own considerable age. He was a tall vampire, with white hair worn in a long plait over one shoulder, and eyes the color of old storm clouds, and the look he gave Seraphine was the specific grief of a man who had been betrayed by someone he had known for a very long time. "Seraphine," he said, and nothing else, and that single name contained everything. What followed was the formal business of court justice, and it took several hours, and it was thorough. The evidence Amara had documented was presented to the High Council's precise, organized format. The secondary documents were retrieved. The compound was identified and confirmed by a council alchemist who tested the remaining contents of the ritual cup. Seraphine's network of alliances was unraveled layer by layer as the enforcers began working through the court with the quiet, systematic efficiency of people who had centuries of practice. Throughout all of it, Marius stood near Amara, not beside her exactly, but close, in that specific way he had developed over 3 months of archive evenings, where his positioning was always between her and the most likely direction of any potential threat, and which he had never once commented on or drawn attention to. She noticed everything, as she always did, when the formal proceedings concluded and the High Council enforcers led Seraphine and 3 of his allies away, and the court gradually, shakily returned to something like its normal functioning. Vladek crossed the room to where Marius and Amara stood. He looked at Amara for a long moment with those old, complicated eyes. "You notified the council," he said. "Yes," she said. "Through the human safety channel. I took a liberal interpretation of the criterion," she said, without apology. The elder was quiet for a moment. Then something moved in his face that might have been amusement, if amusement could exist alongside the weight of what had just occurred in his court. "Marius," he said, without looking away from Amara, "I believe this remarkable woman may have just saved both of our lives." "I am aware," Marius said. Vladek looked at him then, and the exchange that passed between them in that look was complex and ancient and private, the communication of 2 beings who had known each other for a very long time. "We have much to address," Vladek said, "but not tonight. Tonight this court needs to understand what just happened and why. And," he added, with that edge of something like wry affection, "I believe you have things to attend to." He left them. The court had largely emptied of everyone except the officials who remained for documentation and cleanup. The great hall, with its black marble floors and high vaulted ceiling carved from the bedrock beneath Vienna, felt very large and very quiet. Amara was standing near one of the stone columns, and she was not visibly shaking, but Marius, who had spent 3 months learning her tells, could see it in the careful deliberateness of how she was holding herself. He crossed to her. He did not think carefully about what he was doing. He simply crossed to her and stood close and said, "You are cold." "I am fine," she said. "You are cold, and you have been running on adrenaline for the last 90 minutes, and it is wearing off." She looked up at him, and for the first time that evening the composure slipped just slightly, not dramatically, just enough for him to see what was beneath it, which was the same thing he had seen every time he had surprised her guard down in those archive evenings. A person who was genuinely present, genuinely feeling, and genuinely not pretending. "I was very frightened," she said quietly. "Not when it was happening, afterward." "That is how it works," he said. "The fear waits. Is that true for you as well?" He was quiet for a moment. "It used to be true for me," he said, "when I was younger, before I had been doing this long enough to stop feeling most things during moments like that. But tonight I felt it, while it was happening." She looked at him steadily. "What did you feel?" He met her eyes and did not look away. "Fear," he said. "Real fear, the kind I had forgotten was possible, because you were standing in front of that blade." The quiet that followed was not empty. It was the kind of quiet that settles between two people when something important has just been said, and both of them are deciding what comes next. "I noticed you walking me back from the archive the first time," she said. "I did not say anything for a long time because I was not sure what to say. I am very good at waiting until I know what I want to say." "I know," he said. "I know what I want to say now," she said. "I want to say that I was frightened tonight because losing you was unthinkable to me. Not as an interesting person I have been talking to in an archive. Losing you specifically as the person you are to me, which is something I did not have a name for until tonight, but I do now." Marius was very still in the way. Only a very old vampire could be still. Not the stillness of something absent, but the stillness of something that has concentrated itself entirely into a single point. "Amara," he said. Her name in his voice was something different from how anyone else said it, lower and more precise, like he had been working out exactly how to say it correctly for some time. "Yes," she said. "I have spent 400 years protecting people because it was my function and my sworn duty, and because I was exceptionally good at it. I have never once, in those 400 years, had step in front of something intended for me." He paused. "I find that I do not know what to do with that." "You do not need to do anything with it immediately," she said. "I am not going anywhere. You will, eventually. Your archive access has a term. Your research will conclude." "My research could be extended," she said, matter-of-factly. "I have material that would take several years to work through thoroughly. I mentioned this to Administrator Gregor last month. I expect I could formally request an extension if there were a reason to stay." He looked at her for a long time. "Is there a reason to stay?" "I think you know there is," she said, with that same quiet directness that had been dismantling him for 3 months. "The question is whether you would like to say something about it." He reached out and touched her face, his hand careful and deliberate, and for all that he was a 400-year-old vampire who had survived blood wars and court coups, and a blade to his own throat that evening, the touch was tentative, like something he was not sure he was permitted. His skin was cool against hers, and his eyes in the amber light of the great hall were a deep grey, like stone under water. "I would like," he said slowly, "to say several things about it, but I have spent a very long time being precise in my speech, and I want to be precise now." "Take your time," she said, and the warmth in her voice was quiet and complete and entirely real. "I am not an easy thing to be near," he said. "This court, this life, what I am, what I do, none of it is simple or safe for a human being. The blood laws place restrictions on what I can promise you and what the court can officially acknowledge. There are protocols governing relationships between court members and human researchers that exist for legitimate reasons. Because the power imbalance is real and the consequences for humans who are exposed to deep court politics are serious, as you experienced personally tonight." "I am aware of all of this," she said. "I know you are. I am saying it not because I think you are uninformed, but because I need you to hear that I have thought about it, that I have thought about nothing else for weeks. That the reason I kept walking you back from the archive every evening was not only that I wanted to, though I absolutely wanted to, but because the alternative, leaving you unescorted in corridor, as I know the security protocols of, and you do not, was something I could not make myself do, and that distinction matters to me. The distinction between wanting to be near me and needing to keep me safe," she said. "Yes, both things are true. I need you to know that I am not confusing one for the other. Marius," she said, and his name in her voice was something he wanted to save carefully somewhere. "I teach 17-year-olds about the political motivations behind historical events for a living. I am fairly practiced at understanding when someone has complicated reasons for their behavior and whether those reasons are honest. Your reasons are honest, all of them." Something in his face shifted, not dramatically. He was not a dramatic person, which was one of the many things she found she loved about him, but something real moved through his expression, and it looked very much like relief. "Then I would like," he said, "to continue walking you back from the archive, and I would like your research extension to be approved, and I would like to spend considerably more time finding out what it is like to have someone near me who is not afraid of me and does not perform anything and tells me directly what she thinks." "I would like that too," she said, "and I would like, eventually, when we have both had time to think carefully, and you have not just nearly been killed in my court." He paused, and the pause held something careful and entirely genuine. "To tell you precisely what I mean when I say that your absence from this building on the evenings you do not come is something I feel as a specific lack, like a room I have become accustomed to that has had its light removed." Amara looked at him for a moment, and her eyes were bright and steady. "That," she said, "is very well said for someone who needed time to be precise." "I practiced," he said, and the thing that crossed his face then was the rarest thing she had ever seen on him, the trace of something like self-deprecating humor, so brief and so unguarded that it felt like being handed something private. She laughed softly, and the sound of it in the stone hall was something that had never been there before, and that Marius thought he would spend a very long time making sure could happen again. The aftermath of a court betrayal of Seraphine's scale was not a brief or simple process, and the weeks that followed were complicated for both of them. The High Council investigation required Amara's testimony in a formal session, which was unprecedented for a human researcher and required specific protocols to be established more or less on the fly. She gave her testimony with the same organized precision she brought to everything, presenting her documented evidence in a format so clear that the lead council investigator, a vampire named Corvina, who was believed to be older than most of the existing court records, had paused afterward and looked at Amara with an evaluative expression and said, "You are a historian." "Yes," Amara had said. "We have need of historians who are precise," Corvina had said, and left it at that, though it turned out not to be nothing, because 3 weeks later, Amara received a formal letter from the High Council office offering her an extended research partnership with both the Dracovian archive and the Council's own historical collection, which was significantly larger and had never been offered to an outside researcher before. She had brought the letter to Marius. He had read it and then looked at her, and she saw in his face that he had not known this was coming, that it was a council decision independent of anything he had arranged, and that he was experiencing something that looked very much like the vampire equivalent of being flushed with emotion, which, on a pale-skinned, white-haired, centuries-old, being manifested as a particular brightness in the eyes and a very slight tension in the jaw, as though feeling things that strongly required some structural support. "You did not arrange this," she said. "No," he said. "The council make determinations, but you are pleased I am," he said carefully, "extraordinarily pleased." She sat down across from him at the reading table, which was where they had always ended up, the table that had become theirs by accumulated habit. "There is a complication," she said. "Tell me. The partnership terms specify that I would need to relocate, to be in residence near the court for the primary research period, which is a minimum of 2 years. She placed the letter on the table between them. "That is a significant life change. I have a position at home, a life above ground, obligations." "Yes," he said. "The partnership offers accommodations and a research stipend that would cover my financial needs. My teaching position would have to be left. I have colleagues and students who I would need to properly hand off and leave." "Well, yes," he said again, still very careful. "What I am trying to determine," she said, looking at him directly, "is whether this is something worth doing for the research alone, which it is. It genuinely is. The collection is extraordinary. Or whether I am also making this decision because of something else. And if it is something else, I want to make sure that something else is real and not a thing I have constructed from proximity and gratitude and the adrenaline of a very dramatic evening." Marius was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How would you determine whether it is real?" "By asking you a direct question," she said. "Then ask it." "Do you want me here?" she said. And the question was simple and clean, and she held his gaze while she asked it. "Not in the general sense. Not because you feel responsible for my safety or because my research is genuinely useful, though both of those things are true. Do you want me here, Marius, specifically and personally, in the way that a person wants another particular person to be part of their life?" He did not hesitate. That was what she noticed most. There was no hesitation at all. "Yes," he said, "entirely and without reservation," she exhaled. "Then I would like to accept the partnership." "Good," he said, and the simplicity of it, the lack of any ceremony or complication, was so entirely him that she felt something settle in her chest, like a key turning in a lock. What followed was a period she would remember later as the most unexpected and most quietly joyful months of her adult life. She went back to Portland, wrapped up her affairs with the thoroughness she brought to everything, said proper goodbyes to her colleagues, handed off her students to a replacement she had vetted personally, and returned to Vienna with 2 large suitcases and a crate of books and the particular sensation of someone who has made a frightening choice and discovered midway through making it that the fear has been entirely replaced by certainty. Marius was at the court entrance when she arrived. He had not told her he would be there, and she understood from this that he had made a specific decision to be there, which meant he had reorganized whatever his evening's responsibilities had been, which, for the head guard of the Dracovian court, was not a small thing. He took one of her suitcases from her. She let him. They walked through the blood-keyed door and into the corridor below, and she looked at the stone walls and the bronze light fixtures and the smell of old books and history that permeated everything, and she felt clearly and completely that she was somewhere she was supposed to be. "Welcome back," he said. "Thank you," she said, and then, because she had been thinking about it carefully on the flight over and had determined what she wanted to say, "I am glad to be back. More than I expected to be, and I expected to be very glad." He looked at her sideways in the amber corridor light. "I am glad you are back more than I expected to be," he said, "and my expectations were already considerable. We are going to be very honest with each other," she observed. "I think we always have been," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is one of the things I like best about us." The word us landed in the space between them with a gentle, solid weight, and neither of them felt the need to comment on it because it was simply accurate. The months that followed built something between them with the steady, real quality of things that are not rushed. There was the research, which was genuine and significant and consumed Amara deeply in the best way. Entire days lost to the archive, with Corvina's collection supplementing Vladek's. Threads of history emerging from documents that had not been read by anyone with fresh eyes in 2 centuries. She was meticulous and enthusiastic in a combination that was rare, and the court officials who worked alongside her, initially wary of a human given such deep access, became gradually and visibly converted to a kind of collegial respect. Marius came to the archive every evening, and they talked about her research, about his memories of the events she was studying, about the philosophy of historical documentation, and what it meant to be an eyewitness to your own footnotes. About smaller things, too. The particular difficulty of archiving documents that had been written in dying languages, the court's history of losing records to political purges, the specific satisfaction of finding a document that corroborated something you had theorized, and the specific frustration of finding one that did not. He told her things about himself that he had not told anyone, not from the impulse to confess, but from the discovery that she received what he said without performing anything in response, without making it into something it was not. She asked questions that went exactly where he thought no one would look, quietly and with genuine curiosity, and he answered them because not answering felt like a waste of something important. She told him about her own life above ground, the 15 years of teaching that had given her something she had not expected, not just knowledge about history, but something about the experience of watching young people encounter ideas for the first time, the specific privilege of being present when something opens inside a mind. She missed her students more than she had expected to, and she said so, and he listened to that with the same attention. He gave everything and asked her what she wanted to do about it. She thought about that seriously. "I could propose a formal history education program," she said slowly, "for the junior members of the court. There are very young vampires here, relatively speaking, who have lived through events they do not have context for. I could help with that." He had looked at her with that look she was learning to recognize, the one that was not surprise exactly, but was adjacent to it, the expression of someone who keeps encountering the same quality in a person and being struck each time by the consistency of it. "That is a remarkable idea," he said. "Do not sound surprised. I have good ideas consistently." "I know you do," he said. "That is not what I am feeling." "What are you feeling?" He was quiet for a moment. "I am feeling that you continue to find ways to be exactly where you are, not adapting to a place that does not quite fit, not performing belonging, simply being here fully, as yourself, making the place fit you rather than the reverse." She looked at him steadily across the reading table. And I find that I am," he said, and paused, and chose the word carefully, "devoted to that, to you, in ways that I am still learning the vocabulary for, because I spent 400 years developing the vocabulary of duty, and I am having to learn a new language." Amara reached across the table and put her hand over his. His skin was cool, as it always was, and his hand was still for a moment, and then turned beneath hers and held it with the deliberate, careful quality of everything he did. "You are doing very well with the new language," she said quietly. The formal acknowledgement of what they were to each other came in the way that things in the Dracovian court came, through proper channels and ancient protocols, but with a reality behind it that the protocols were simply catching up to. Vladek, who had survived the attempted coup of his head guard's betrayal and emerged from the High Council proceedings with his position secured and a notable reduction in internal political threat, had occasion to speak with Marius formally 6 months after the night of the offering ceremony. "The blood laws regarding court officials and human partners are specific," Vladek said. He was not disapproving, he was being exact, which Marius understood and respected. A declared bond between a court official and a human requires formal registration with the High Council and specific protections placed on the human partner. It also requires the human partner's informed consent to a form of extended association that has implications. "I know the laws," Marius said. "I know you know them. I am asking whether you have spoken about them with her." "Not yet," Marius said. "I wanted the choice to be entirely hers without the weight of what I want influencing the decision she makes." Vladek looked at him for a long moment. "You have never declared a bond before," he said. "No, in 400 years, no." Vladek was quiet, and when he spoke again, his voice had something in it that was not entirely administrative. "Then, I think you should speak with her. The blood laws can be navigated when the will to navigate them exists on both sides. And I believe," he said carefully, "that I owe her a considerable debt, which I intend to repay partly by ensuring the court accommodates whatever she decides." Marius spoke with her that evening. He did not do it at the reading table, because what he had to say was not a research conversation, and he did not want to have it in the space they had built for research, did not want to layer a weighty thing over something light. He asked her instead if she would walk with him, and they went through a part of the lower court she had not been to yet, older corridors where the stone was carved in the style of 4 centuries past, when Marius himself had first come to this court as a young vampire newly sworn to service. He showed her those things as they walked. Small details, he pointed out, that were part of his own history with this place, and she looked at everything with the particular attention she brought to archives, seeing not just what was there but what it meant, asking questions that showed she understood the context. Then he stopped. In a corridor that opened into a small chamber with no particular function, except that it was beautiful, carved stone with a window of frosted glass, set high in the wall that let in the diffuse, cool light of the evening sky above. "I need to tell you about the blood laws," he said, and he told her. He told her clearly, because that was the only way he knew how to do things, the formal structure of what a declared bond meant in vampire law, the registration, the protections, the implications. He told her what she would gain, which was formal court standing and specific protections that the court was obligated by ancient code to uphold. He told her what it would mean for her life, the expanded entanglement with a world that was not entirely safe and not entirely simple. He told her, carefully and completely, so that nothing was left out. Then he said, "I am telling you this because I want you to know the full shape of what I am asking before I ask it. I do not want to ask something of you that you have said yes to, without understanding it entirely." She had been listening to all of this with her thinking expression, the slight furrow between her brows, her eyes moving through everything he said, the way her eyes moved through a complex primary source. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What are you asking, Marius?" "Specifically, I am asking," he said, "whether you would be willing to consider a formal bond. Whether. What we are to each other is something we want to have named and protected by the laws of this world, with the full understanding of what that means. Are you asking because the laws require you to, or because you want to?" She said, "Because I want to," he said, without hesitation. "The laws do not require this. The laws only have jurisdiction once I ask. I am asking because I would like very much for there to be a formal name for what you are to me, and because the protections it would afford you matter to me more than I can say." She looked at him for a long time. The evening light came through the frosted glass and made everything soft and cool and very still. "I want to ask you something first," she said. "Ask it. What happens to you if I say no?" He blinked. It was a very small thing, barely visible, but she caught it because she always caught his small things. "I continue as I am," he said. "Nothing changes for me in terms of my position or my life." "That is not what I asked," she said gently. "I asked what happens to you." He was quiet for longer than usual. "I would be," he said finally, very honestly, "diminished. Not in any dramatic sense. I would still function and do my work and be precisely who I have always been. But you have become," he paused, searching, "necessary. That is the word. Not in a way I would ask you to be responsible for, because your choice has to be yours entirely. But the question of what it is like to be me, without you near, is one I do not want to answer." Amara stepped forward and took both of his hands in hers and looked up at him with those steady dark eyes that never performed anything. "Yes," she said. "Yes," he repeated, as though making sure he had heard it correctly. "Yes, Marius, I want to be formally bonded to you, with full understanding of what that means, because I have thought about it without you asking and arrived at the same place, and I was waiting for you to get there." She held his gaze steadily. "You are also necessary to me. I am also diminished by the thought of the alternative. We are apparently both in the same situation, which makes the decision fairly straightforward." He held her hands and looked at her, and the expression on his face was something she had never quite seen before. Not because it was complicated, but because it was entirely simple. It was a face from which every guard had been removed. It was Marius Dragomir, without the 4 centuries of armor, which turned out to be something much younger and much more real and very beautiful. "I love you," he said, and the precision of it, the directness, was so entirely him that she felt it land in her chest like something that had always been meant to be there. "I love you," she said. "I have been fairly sure of that for several months, but I was waiting for you to be ready to say it." "You were waiting for me," he said. "I am a patient person," she said. "I have spent 15 years waiting for teenagers to be ready to engage with ideas. You are not substantially different." He made a sound that was very close to a laugh, which was still rare enough that she treasured it every time, and he pulled her forward gently and held her, his arms around her, with the careful, deliberate quality of every physical thing he did, as though she was something he was choosing to hold rather than simply holding, as though the choice were worth making deliberately every time. She leaned into him and felt the cool steadiness of him and the particular quality of being held by something that was both enormously strong and enormously careful, and thought that this was the most precisely right thing she had felt in her life. The formal bond registration was processed through the High Council in the proper manner, and Corvina, who processed the paperwork personally rather than delegating it, had looked at the documentation with an expression of particular satisfaction, and said to no one in particular that the blood laws had existed for 1,000 years, and occasionally they existed for very good reasons. The court's junior education program that Amara proposed was approved by Vladek 3 weeks later and began the following month. It was formally titled the Historical Context Initiative and informally referred to by every young court member who attended it as Amara's classes, which was what it was. She taught 2 sessions per week in a lower chamber that was repurposed for the purpose and equipped with a proper whiteboard that she had requested specifically because she had 15 years of habits, and she intended to keep them. The young vampires who attended, some of them barely a century old, and most of them deeply wary of a human standing at the front of a room and telling them things, became, within 4 sessions, an audience of intensely engaged students who argued about historical interpretation and challenged her sources and occasionally discovered that they had personal memories of events she was discussing and could offer primary accounts that sent her into visible, uncontained delight that was completely infectious. Marius attended 1 session without announcing he was going to. He sat in the back of the chamber, which was unusual enough that the students noticed and were visibly unsettled until Amara, without breaking her train of thought, said calmly, "The head guard is welcome here, as is anyone who would like to learn something today," and continued explaining the political dynamics of a 14th century blood council dispute. And the students decided that if she was not concerned, they would not be either. Afterward, he walked with her back through the corridors, and she asked him what he had thought, and he said that watching her teach was one of the most extraordinary things he had witnessed in 4 centuries. "In 4 centuries," she repeated, smiling. "In 4 centuries," he confirmed. "I have witnessed the founding of several nations. Watching you is more interesting." "You are going to become insufferable," she said affectionately. "I have been insufferable for 400 years," he said. "It has simply taken on a new quality." And it echoed in the stone corridor, and a junior official, passing in the opposite direction, glanced at the head guard of the Dracovian court, walking alongside his bonded partner, with an expression of uncomplicated warmth on his face, and the official made a mental note to tell everyone he knew. The court had changed since the night of Seraphin's betrayal, not dramatically, but in the way that organizations change when a long-building toxin is removed. Vladek was more visible in the subsequent months, less insulated by the layers of political caution that Seraphin's presence had made necessary. Several court positions were restructured, and the blood law protections for human partners of court officials were reviewed and formally strengthened at Vladek's initiative. It was a quiet shift, but it was real, and those who had lived through the previous structure felt it. Marius felt it most clearly in his own work. He had spent decades as head guard operating under a specific heightened vigilance, a constant awareness of internal threat vectors, of the possibility that the danger to those he protected was as likely to come from within as from without. That particular vigilance did not leave entirely, because 4 centuries of it did not simply depart, but it shifted in quality. He began training a new cohort of junior guards with a deliberateness he had not brought to the role before, not just teaching them protective technique, but teaching them to understand the political dimensions of the threats they were guarding against. He taught them to read court dynamics. He taught them to notice things before those things became crises. Amara noticed the change in how he described this work to her, and said one evening, "You are trying to build something that does not depend entirely on you." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "that is what a good teacher does," she said. "Makes themselves eventually unnecessary." He looked at her. "I do not think I am yet ready to be unnecessary." "You have time," she said. "You have quite a lot of time." This was something they had discussed, quietly and carefully, in the way they discussed all serious things. The question of time, of what her human life meant in the context of a vampire's immortality, was not a question that resolved easily or quickly, and they did not pretend it did. There were options within vampire lore and tradition, not simple ones, not automatic ones, but real ones that existed, because this situation was not without precedent, and the blood laws, for all their ancient rigidity, had evolved over centuries to address complex realities. The option that existed, and that they both knew existed, was a formal transfer of blood heritage, a process that was irreversible and required the consent of the court elder and the high council and the individual themselves. And that was not undertaken lightly, because it was not light. It was the oldest kind of covenant in vampire society, older than most of the written laws, and it carried weight in proportion. "I want you to have time," Marius had said one night, very directly, when they were sitting together in the archive, in the comfortable quiet that had become one of her favorite versions of him. Marius at rest, present and unhurried. "I want you to have all the time you could want, but I also want you to choose whatever you choose, because it is what you want, not because I want it, or because the alternative feels like loss." She had sat with that for a while before she answered, and he had let her sit with it because he knew how she worked, and he had learned to value that she took her time with things that mattered. "The alternative does feel like loss," she said finally. "I am not going to pretend it does not. But that is not the same as it being the wrong feeling to have. Loss is sometimes the accurate feeling. What I need to think about is whether the thing on the other side of that loss, the alternative shape of a life, is a thing I genuinely want, or a thing I want because I cannot bear the thought of not being with you. And I am still thinking," she said. "I will tell you when I have finished." He had nodded and turned back to the document he was reading, and she had loved him enormously in that moment for not pushing, for simply accepting that she needed to work through it and would tell him when she was ready. She had told him 4 months later, on a night in late November, when the air above Vienna was cold enough that the warmth of the underground court was particularly welcome, and she had made her decision not through any single revelation, but through the accumulation of days, of evenings in the archive, of watching him work, of teaching her classes and walking the stone corridors and feeling, consistently and completely, that this was her life, and she wanted all of it, every part of it, as much of it as could possibly exist. "I want to stay," she said, "not because I cannot bear to leave, because I want this life, all of it, including what that means." Marius set down what he was holding and looked at her with everything he had, no armor, no guard, just completely present. "Are you certain?" he said. "I have been teaching history for 15 years, she said. "I am very aware of the weight of permanent decisions. I am certain." The process that followed required exactly as much protocol as she had expected, which was considerable, and she moved through it with exactly as much patience and precision as she brought to everything else. There was the formal petition, the High Council review, the elder Vladek's testimony, which he gave with an air of someone who had been waiting to give it, and was quietly pleased to finally have the occasion. Corvina reviewed the case with the particular thoroughness of someone who had seen this go wrong before, and intended that it would not go wrong now, and asked Amara questions that were probing and serious and specific, and Amara answered them all directly and without hesitation. Corvina, at the end of that session, had looked at her for a long time and then said, "The blood laws require me to ask you one final question. Are you entering this covenant freely, with full understanding, and with no coercion of any kind?" "Yes," Amara had said, with a steadiness that Corvina later described to her senior colleagues as the most unambiguous affirmative. She had received in her considerable experience of this process. It happened on a night in December, and it was one of the most significant experiences of her life, and it was also, somehow in some essential way, exactly as private and exactly as personal as everything important between them had always been. Marius was formal through the official portions, because that was who he was, every word of the ancient covenant language delivered precisely, but his eyes on her throughout were not formal at all. They were the eyes of someone who was giving everything they had and knew it and was not afraid of knowing it. Afterward, in the quiet, in the small, with chambers of frostgland that had become, without either of them deciding it, the place where the most important things between them happened, he held her face in both his hands and looked at her with the expression that she had seen for the first time the night she had said yes to the formal bond. The expression of Marius Dragomir without any armor. "How do you feel?" he said. She checked carefully, as was her way. "Different, she's not wrong. Just different, like the first morning of a new season." He pressed his forehead very gently against hers. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly how it feels." The year that followed was the year she sometimes thought of later, as the year they learned each other, without the urgency of danger or the weight of decisions still unmade. They had time, genuinely, and they used it in the way two people use time when they are both serious and genuinely interested in the world and in each other. They argued about historical interpretation, and she was right more often than he was about events she had not witnessed, and he was right more often than she was about events he had, and they both considered this fair. He taught her to navigate the court with the fluency of a full member, not just a guest, which took time because there were centuries of political texture to absorb. She taught him things about the lived experience of being a young person in the 21st century above ground that he had observed but never fully understood, and he found this genuinely illuminating in a way that he told her was making him a better intelligence analyst, and she told him she would put that on her teaching evaluation. They had, in their life together, beneath Vienna and occasionally above it, in the brief hours of overcast days, when the filtered light was manageable and the world above felt like something she could show him rather than something entirely separate, a quality of companionship that was specific to two people who are both genuinely themselves and genuinely interested in each other. Not mirrored, not merged, but adjacent, each distinct and fully present. He remained the head guard of the Dracovian court because he was still, without question, the most qualified being for the role, and because it was not in his nature to abandon a responsibility he had chosen. But the quality of his guardianship shifted over the years in ways the court could feel without always naming. He was still formidable, still utterly competent, still the specific combination of dangerous and honorable that had defined him for 4 centuries. But there was, in the way he moved through the court, a groundedness that had not been there before. A sense of someone who had something at the center of their life that was entirely real, and from which everything else extended with greater stability. Amara continued the historical context initiative, which grew over the years from 2 sessions a week to a full formal program with 3 instructors, 2 of whom were former students of hers who had proved exceptional in their own historical analysis. She continued her research with Corvina's archive, producing 2 monographs that were distributed within vampire scholarly circles under a pseudonym, because the official relationship between vampire academic publication and human academic publication was a complicated question she was working on solving, and until she solved it, the pseudonym was practical. She was working on solving it. She was always working on the next thing. That was one of the things he found most entirely wonderful about her, that she was never finished, never settled of having arrived somewhere and being done. She was always looking at the next problem, with that patient, precise attention, already gathering the threads of what she would do about it. He told her once that she was always moving towards something, and she had looked at him with a slight smile and said, "So are you. You have been training your junior guards to think instead of just react to for 2 years. You are building something, as you just do not call it moving toward anything." "I prefer strategic development," he said. "Yes," she said, "that sounds much more like you." There were difficult periods, because a life that contains genuine things will always contain difficult periods. There were moments when the gulf between what he was and what she had been was something she felt as a specific weight, not regret, but the honest complexity of a large and permanent choice. There were moments when the court's old tensions resurfaced, when new political pressures arrived from outside, when being the bonded partner of the head guard meant being targeted as a pressure point by people who had not yet learned what Seraphin Voss had learned. Every time a threat emerged, the shape of their response was the same, because the shape of their relationship was the shape of their response. They told each other the truth about what was happening, and then they figured out what to do about it, together, with her analytical precision and his 4 centuries of protective experience making between them a combinations that proved to be extremely difficult to outmaneuver. Word moved through the circles of court politics in the way that truth eventually moves quietly and then everywhere at once. The human partner of Marius Dragomir was not a vulnerability. She was not a lever or a pressure point or a soft place in his armor. She was, in her own specific way, as difficult to underestimate as he was, and underestimating her had historically gone poorly for people who had tried it. This understanding, combined with Marius's undiminished reputation, produced a period of unusual stability in the Dracovian court that Vladek, entering his 7th century and increasingly philosophical about the nature of things, credited in part to what he privately thought of as the recalibration of his head guard, a Marius who was fully alive in a way he had not been for a very long time, was a Marius who brought a different quality of attention to every room he entered. Vladek said something to this effect once, obliquely, during one of the formal elder councils, and Marius had looked at him with the flat, unamused expression that was his standard response to any comment approaching the personal, and Vladek had smiled the small smile of someone who does not need a response because he already has his answer. On the evening that Amara completed the first full draft of what she was describing as a structural history of vampire court governance from the pre-medieval period to the present day, using primary sources that no human historian had ever accessed, she found Marius waiting for her outside the archive with 2 cups of the court's strong-herbed tea that a thoughtful kitchen official had apparently been convinced to prepare at his request. She looked at the tea and looked at him. "You knew I would finish tonight," she said. "You told me 2 weeks ago that you would finish tonight," he said. "You are very rarely wrong about your own timelines." "Anne, never wrong," she said, taking the tea. "Once wrong," he said. "The Vienna archive, the secondary section. You said 3 weeks and it took 4. Alum. The documents were in worse condition than indicated," she said. "That is exogenous variance. It does not count." "It counts," he said. "It absolutely does not count." They walked the way they often walked in the evenings through the older corridors, past the carved stone details of the era when Marius had first come to this court, past the archive rooms and the council chambers, and the small chamber with the frosted glass window that was now, formally and practically, their room, the place where the court understood that they were not to be interrupted without considerable justification. They settled into the comfortable quiet that was one of her favorite things, and she sat beside him and leaned against him and felt the cool steadiness of him, the particular quality of a presence that was so entirely consistent across years that it had become the background against which everything else in her life was measured. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me I think about the night of the offering sometimes," she said. "Not often, but sometimes. I think about the moment I stepped in front of you." "So do I," he said. "Do you know what I think about specifically?" she said. "Tell me." "I think about the fact that I was not afraid," she said. "Not of Seraphine, and not of the blade, and not of any of it. The only thing I was afraid of was what would happen if I did not do it. That is the only fear I had." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he says. "I could see it in how you stood. You were not afraid of him. You were afraid of losing something." "Yes," she said. "You." He put his arm around her, a gesture that still carried the deliberateness of something chosen rather than simply done, even after years. "You have not lost me," he said. "No," she agreed. "I have not. You will not," he said, and the simplicity of it, the complete lack of drama in how he said the most absolute thing he had ever said to her, was so entirely him that she felt it in every part of herself. "I know," she said. They sat together in the comfortable quiet of their room, with the history of 4 centuries in the stone around them, and the history of 5 years of their own making in the air between them, and the frosted glass above let in the diffuse light of a city night, and Amara Sinclair leaned her head against Marius Dragomir's shoulder and felt, clearly and completely and without a single reservation, that she was precisely where she was meant to be. The head guard, who had protected every other soul for 400 years, had, in the end, needed someone to decide. It was his turn. She had made that decision on a night when a blade was raised and the courtroom held its breath, and she had made it again every day since, in the smaller ways that did not require courage from either of them, but were true regardless. She had stepped in front of something terrible for him, and he had spent 5 years since stepping in front of everything else for her, and between them they had built a life that was full and real, and entirely theirs. The court continued. The history continued, being made by people and recorded by her and remembered by him. The junior guards trained and the archive expanded, and Covina occasionally appeared in their corridor with a document that she thought Amara would find interesting, and was never wrong. Vladek aged in the way of very old vampires, slowly and with increasing depth rather than diminishment, and he and Marius continued their working relationship with the easy fluency of two beings who had been in each other's orbit for a very long time, and had arrived at something like genuine mutual respect. And Amara continued forward, as she always did, into the next thing she was working on, and the next question she needed to answer, and the next problem she had noticed that nobody had addressed yet, and Marius was beside her for all of it, or slightly in front when the situation required it, which was a distinction she considered entirely fair, since she had established it herself. There were evenings when he looked at her across a room, or a reading table, or the comfortable space of the life they had made, and felt the specific quality of something that he had spent 4 centuries operating without, and had not known was missing until it arrived. Not the absence of a thing exactly, because absence implies knowing what is gone, more like discovering a room in a house you have lived in for centuries and finding it full of light. She had done that. She had walked into his court with her 2 suitcases and her crate of books, and her absolute refusal to be afraid of what was extraordinary, and she had stood in front of a blade for him and organized the High Council evidence and proposed an education program and told him directly what she wanted, and waited patiently for him to be ready and chosen to stay. And in doing all of it, she had given him back something that had calcified so slowly over 4 centuries that he had not noticed it leaving. The capacity to be in a life rather than simply maintaining one. He was grateful for it every day, in the specific, undramatic way of someone who knows what they have and does not need to perform knowing it. He simply lived it, with her, in the court beneath Vienna, where the history ran so deep in the stone that you could feel it underfoot, in the life they had built together out of archive evenings and honest conversations, and one extraordinary night when she had decided, with the quiet certainty that was entirely hers, that it was his turn to be protected. She had been right, as she usually was. He had needed it, and everything that followed, all of it, had been worth exactly what it cost, which was the particular courage of stepping into something real without any guarantee of how it would go, and finding on the other side of that courage a life so full and so true that the word extraordinary did not quite cover it, though it was without question that.